On the 25th of July 2000, 100 holidaymakers boarded Air France flight 4590. It was no ordinary trip. They were traveling the world's only supersonic airliner, Concorde. At 4:42, Charles de Gaulle Air Traffic Control cleared the flight for takeoff.
Air France 4590. Alignez-vous sur piste 26 droite.
C'est près derrière. On y va. Préparez-vous pour décollage. R100, BE, 150, top. 4 V1.
Concorde 4590, vous avez des flammes derrière vous. 4590, vous avez de fortes flammes derrière vous. Pompier leader, le Concorde, je ne connais pas ses intentions.
On essaie le portrait. Non?
90 seconds after takeoff, Air France flight 4590 crashed. All 109 passengers and crew and 4 on the ground were killed. Now, 10 years on, arguments are still raging about what may have really caused the crash.
The accident was not one piece of metal on the runway. It was a series of events. A lot of innocent, good people lost their lives. It should never have happened.
On that day, Concorde went from being the safest aeroplane in the world to the most dangerous, igniting debate about whether her design was fatally flawed.
Don't try and tell me that there were design deficiencies in Concorde. I do not accept that. I spent 15 years flying that airplane, and I regard it as the safest airplane I have ever flown.
The crash was the beginning of the end for supersonic passenger flight. Concorde ended up a museum exhibit when she could still be flying today. This is the story of the most ambitious dream in aviation history, and the untold story of what really destroyed it.
Okay, chaps, all set? Yep. 3, 2, 1, now.
For over 27 years, Concorde took passengers to the very edge of space, at speeds faster than a bullet.
It was so advanced, very exciting, very, very beautiful, very fast. Here was the most advanced aircraft in the world.
The actual shape of it and the sound of it symbolized creativity.
People in the streets would look up, and they'd look up with pride, and they'd see this beautiful aeroplane. They would see it and they would say, we're part of it. We're proud of it. It's ours.
It symbolized optimism. It was everything that the 20th century could have stood for.
Concorde was a unique achievement in an age that believed in technology and speed. The British love affair with Concorde began in 1969, the year that man walked on the moon.
Well, I was there when it was rolled out. It was a bit like an English cricket match. We were all waiting. And then finally, Brian Trubshaw, the pilot, appeared. And people shouted, good old Trubby, as if he was going to bat.
Concorde was a joint venture between France and Britain. And the French had successfully flown their prototype a month earlier. Now it was Britain's turn to prove itself to the world. Some instruments had been playing up, so Trubby initially went for just a crowd-pleasing taxi run. But when they suddenly began to work, he surprised everyone and took off.
I mean, the noise was unbelievable. I began vibrating because of the pressure of the engine. It was an absolutely shattering experience. A great line of smoke came behind, and I wondered whether any airline would ever accept it. It was very typically English, I thought, on that occasion.
It was a glorious moment. But Trubby hadn't gone supersonic. He didn't even raise the landing gear. There was still a lot to do before Concorde could take passengers. And there was a race on. In these days of the Cold War between East and West, everyone wanted to be first with a supersonic airliner. Just 2 months earlier, the Russians, working around the clock, had beaten Concorde into the sky. The Western press dubbed it Concordski. President Kennedy called on America to develop an aircraft that could fly at twice the speed of sound.
We are talking about a plane in the end of the 60s that will move ahead at a speed faster than Mach 2 to all corners of the globe.
Boeing answered his call with an ambitious design. It promised to outperform Concorde at Mach 3 and carry twice the number of passengers. The race was not just a matter of national pride. Stakes were high for whoever could sell the world the next generation of airliner. But the challenge was pure science fiction. At the time, only military jets went supersonic, and then for just a matter of minutes, not for a whole flight. And pilots had to wear oxygen masks and pressure suits and rely on ejector seats. The first question was what should be the shape of the wings. A normal wing ripped off in speeds approaching sound. In Britain, designers turned to a shape called the delta wing. But research in the United States had rejected the design as too unsteady.
We'd heard about the Americans and their attitude towards these delta wings, that they thought they would be unstable. As you throw a paper dart, it tends to wallow occasionally, and it's not good to have an aircraft that wallows when the passengers are having their gin and tonic.
Ted worked under the First World War pilot and eccentric W.E. Gray. They refined the delta design to control the air currents that made it unstable.
He used a fishing rod and put the model on the end of it and blew the tunnel at a reasonable speed to show that it didn't even wobble in the tunnel. In the end, that delta was the obvious thing to go to.
The French too had been working on similar ideas for a supersonic airliner. But the enormous challenge and cost meant that neither country could get beyond oversized models. So on the 29th of November 1962, the French and British joined forces and signed an agreement to build Concorde together. The joint venture began on a scale that would rival America's moon project, with a workforce of 200,000. But first, each side had to learn the other's language.
Alors, où est-ce qu'il travaille en ce moment, Mr. MacDonald?
Il travaille dans les ateliers.
While the engineers grappled with pronunciation, the politicians fell out over how to spell Concorde. Should it be spelt the French way with an E on the end, or the English way without?
The British said, we're taking the E off. So I didn't consult anybody, but I simply said, we're going to put it back again. And it did actually hit the headlines that we were going to do that. And I said it stands for England, for the Entente Cordiale, for excellence. And some Treasury officials said, yes, and E for escalation of the extra cost.
For the engineers, the bigger question was how to generate the enormous thrust it would take to push Concorde through the sound barrier. Olympus engines from Britain's nuclear Vulcan bombers were re-engineered. Concorde had 4, producing the equivalent thrust of 6,000 cars. But there was a major problem. Jet engines can't take in air travelling at supersonic speeds. Intakes had to be devised that would slow the air down before it entered the engine.
The challenge of the air intake with Concorde was a massive challenge. It was absolutely incredible what this intake could do. It was using computer power that technically wasn't even around.
The computers controlled flaps that slowed the air down by 1,000 miles an hour in just 14 feet.
Groundbreaking stuff. Absolutely groundbreaking. Nobody else in the whole wide world had done it, and we did it.
No aircraft in history ever underwent such testing and development. But the question remained, would it work? Concorde still had to fly faster than the speed of sound. The race for supersonic flight was on. Now, test pilot André Turcat was ready to take the French Concorde past Mach 1, the speed of sound. This was the most dangerous part of the test program. It would push the aircraft to its limits.
There was no nervousness. If you're nervous in a situation like this, you should change your job. You must never be nervous, always calm.
Inside, a flying laboratory was ready to record every jolt and twitch of Concorde's airframe.
1, 2, 3, top!
Afterburners, usually reserved for fighter jets, kick-started Concorde on its roll to over 250 miles an hour, faster than a Formula One racing car. Concorde's distinctive visor was raised to shape the fuselage into a rocket. As the Concorde approached Mach 1, Turcat offered the glory of breaking the sound barrier to his co-pilot, Jean Pinet.
I said to him, well, now you take it to Mach 1. He was really happy. And it was him who took the first flight to Mach 1.
There was almost no sensation of travelling faster than the speed of sound. The smoothness of the flight was largely due to a startling innovation: fly-by-wire. Pilots had relied on mechanical linkages to move the flaps and rudders. Now, computers analysed and relayed Turcat's commands to the control surfaces. On following flights, Turcat pushed the aircraft on to its limit, over twice the speed of sound, and held it there in continuous supersonic flight. A feat no aircraft had ever achieved before.
Things did begin to warm up. The air conditioning was not fully working, and the oil got hot. But we stayed there for 52 minutes, at Mach 2, while the American prototype, the US model, was still stuck on the ground. So we were really the first.
Vraiment été là les premiers.
Technically, it was a massive leap. I mean, only now, 40 years after the first flight, are things that Concorde had really becoming the norm. The brakes, the fly-by-wire flying controls, some of the systems, the engine control systems. It really was a massive challenge.
Mr. Wedgwood Ben, Minister of Technology, and Monsieur Jean Chamont, French Minister of Transport, were ready to cut the tapes and launch the greatest airliner ever built.
Concorde looked ready to take the world by storm. 16 major airlines placed options for a staggering 74 aircraft. No one wanted to be seen without a Concorde. But the airliner of the future had come at an incredible cost to the French and British taxpayers.
The escalation was on a massive scale. I mean, it cost far more than the company had anticipated. But once you start something like this, you can't pull out.
The project, initially budgeted at £150 million, ended up costing £1.5 billion of taxpayers' money. It was a price the US was not prepared to pay. Boeing scrapped their supersonic rival. The ambitious swept-wing design got no further than an expensive wooden mock-up, costing almost as much as the finished Concorde. It did give the world in-flight entertainment. But Wall Street wasn't prepared to fund it.
Wall Street is not worried about national pride, they're only worried about making money. And when they looked at the numbers for supersonic transport, the numbers just didn't make sense to them.
Wall Street had decided to put its money into another Boeing aircraft. The Jumbo. This was aircraft manufacture on a shipbuilding scale. It wouldn't even go half as fast as Concorde, but it could take over 4 times the number of passengers at a fraction of the cost. Now Concorde was in a new race of speed versus size. To drum up more sales, a Concorde prototype left England to go on a 46,000-mile world sales tour. Flying the flag for Britain was Conservative Aerospace Minister and nervous flyer, Michael Heseltine.
I'd always been rather apprehensive of flying, and so being told that I was going in a prototype but hadn't got a certificate of airworthiness, something like that, was pretty appalling as a concept. And then we set off down this runway. The only reassuring thing for me was that the British Aerospace employees who were there just went to sleep. So I thought, well, you know, they must know something I don't.
Crowds flocked to see the new wonder of the age. But when Concorde arrived in Sydney, the reception wasn't so warm. Protesters had come to demonstrate about Concorde's noise and pollution.
In real terms, the Concorde wasn't a noisy aircraft.
But it wasn't just noise. Environmentalists warned that Concorde's engines would pollute the atmosphere, unleashing disasters from melting ice caps to freezing cold winters. These apocalyptic scenarios proved wildly exaggerated. But Concorde did have one nasty little habit. Its sonic boom.
When an aircraft goes supersonically, there is a very large boom, and that's heard on the ground, and it can literally break windows.
The sonic boom is a continuously produced explosion of sound. The result of shock waves generated at the front and back of the plane. On the ground, it's heard as two bangs as the aircraft passes overhead.
There was anxiety in the cabinet about the bang, and so on one cabinet occasion I told the Prime Minister I was going to bring Concorde over at midday. So as we got to 12, I was getting a little bit nervous, and then I heard a bit of a bang, and people were sort of slightly shaken by it, but it wasn't as big a problem as anyone had thought.
Concorde's designers also thought her booms wouldn't be too much of a nuisance.
I believe the element of alarm will be absent. It's a very characteristic noise, the double bang. There's no danger of people mistaking it for their mother-in-law shooting themselves.
But tests on the public were not encouraging. And when Concorde flew down what became known as Boom Alley along the west coast of Britain, thousands complained. One Scottish woman alleged that the booms had made her pregnant by interrupting her rhythm method of contraception. The sonic boom spelt disaster.
There was no way that any government was going to allow a supersonic airplane to fly routinely over land. And in so doing, it effectively cut about half of all the world's routes away from Concorde.
It was a devastating handicap for a world sales tour.
We were trying to sell it, so we were concentrating on the sales. The problem was there weren't any sales.
Not a single one. Bad news, as Concordes were now rolling off the production line. Worse followed. Airlines cancelled their 74 aircraft. Concorde was too noisy, too expensive, too costly to service, and too thirsty in a world facing rising oil prices. Everyone had decided to buy 747s.
No true private commercial airline bought the aircraft. They saw the business model and they realized they weren't going to make money on it, so they didn't buy it. Plain and simple.
The French and British governments had one last option: to sell Concorde to their own national airlines. But with empty sales books, they smelt a bargain.
I had to deal with British Airways, and there is not the slightest doubt they screwed me to the floorboards. I mean, basically, we gave it to them.
British Airways took delivery of 7 shiny new Concordes, and on the 21st of January 1976, prepared to take their first passengers supersonic. But there was turbulence ahead. American protesters had persuaded the New York Airport Authority to ban Concorde on grounds of noise.
Concorde's survival depended on its permission to operate between London and New York and New York and London. It had to have the blue ribbon route.
So would the environmental movement finally wreck the supersonic dream? The age of supersonic travel had arrived. Almost. New York's Airport Authority was refusing Concorde permission to land. Local residents were up in arms about noise from her engines. The Emergency Coalition to Stop the SST led protests and drive-slows at JFK. Eventually, it was agreed Concorde could make one test flight. On the 19th of October 1977, Air France pilot Jean Franchi and BA captain Brian Walpole flew to JFK. Without this crucial transatlantic route, Concorde's future would be in ruins.
And we landed at JFK. There were people down the side of the runway, people along the taxiways, and we were then taken into the moment of truth. We were briefed on what sort of press we were going to get, and we were warned that they would be hostile. That turned out to be a masterpiece in understatement.
Now, another question, gentleman at the back.
One of the very early questions was, how long, Captain Walpole, will it take you to deafen our children with your aeroplane? At this stage, at the back of the hangar, the doors opened and the Concorde was tractored in. Everybody looked round, and as they looked round, you could hear the gasp, the sighs, oh! And the whole of the tenor of that press conference changed as people were heard clearly say, oh, isn't that beautiful? What an aeroplane. Now, that was a moment in Concorde's life that I will never forget, and a moment in my life that I'll never forget.
But Walpole's ordeal was not over. The following morning, Concorde had to run the gauntlet of the noise monitors. Walpole and his team had spent a year devising a cunning way to outwit them.
The manoeuvre that we did, we're climbing to 50 feet, 25 degrees of bank, throttle back, continue the climb. It was so successful, didn't even trigger the noise monitor, let alone get anywhere near the unacceptable level.
Ladies and gentlemen, Captain Brian Walpole, and welcome to Concorde and our supersonic operation from London Heathrow to New York's John F. Kennedy.
Now, at last, Concorde could fly the premium route it so badly needed. Taking passengers from London to New York in just 3.5 hours, less than half the time of a conventional jet.
My first flight on Concorde, we were waiting for takeoff at the end of the runway, and I thought to myself, do I really want to work on this aircraft? It's a bit like flying in a missile, it's so fast. I thought, too late now, girl, we're off.
Okay, gents. 3, 2, 1, now.
We took civil aviation from 600 miles an hour to 1,350 miles an hour in one single giant stride.
Concorde is just in a class, in a league all of its own. It was the sort of Grand Prix racing car of the flying world. It was very powerful. It was incredibly responsive. You could just fly it with your thumb and your forefinger.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's Captain Walpole, just to let you know how the flight is progressing, and the answer is quickly.
And I eventually mastered the technique after a couple of slips of carrying 15 or so champagne flutes on a silver tray so as not to have a trip.
Okay, coming up through Mark 1. Mark 1. There we are, ladies and gentlemen, we're through Mark 1. The speed of sound, no bumps, no bangs. Concorde. 44,000 feet now. The aircraft will gradually climb as the fuel is consumed and the weight decreases, and continuing the acceleration towards the magic of Mark 2. Mark 2, twice the speed of sound.
At this speed, most passengers remained blissfully unaware Concorde was expanding around them. Friction with the air heated the fuselage from a freezing -56 to a boiling 127 degrees centigrade, stretching it by 8 inches. Little refrigerators switched on to cool the windows, and save anyone burning their fingers.
We were carrying the American team from New York to Malaga for the Ryder Cup, and we decided that they'd try the longest putt. So what they did is the chap putted a ball right back down the length of the aeroplane. They caught it in a cup. And it took 23 seconds. And in that time we'd gone 8.5 miles.
I would like to point out to you the extremely fine view of the curvature of the Earth that we have up here today. That is the curvature of...
One of the great pleasures of flying Concorde was looking out of the tiny windows, because you've got this extraordinary landscape with the Earth curving away at the edges. Felt like being on a spacecraft.
Leaving Heathrow in the evening gave pilots a sight no human had seen before. Travelling faster than the rotation of the Earth, the sun appeared to rise in the west. Concorde flew so high, so fast, American spy planes had to be ordered out of the way.
One of them told me, said they were sitting over Cuba, spying at 60,000 feet and had been for years. They were in spacesuits, sitting on the edge, and then they were told to move north by 30 miles. They asked why. I said, because there's an airliner going past. So he said, we looked out the window and there was a Concorde with 100 people in shirt sleeves drinking champagne.
1350 miles an hour, 23 miles a minute, a mile in every 2 3/4 seconds, 10% faster than a rifle bullet, Land's End to John O'Groats, 24 minutes, Concorde.
But in the first 6 years of service, Concorde lost money. Lots of it. In 1982, BA boss Sir John King decided it was make or break time for Concorde. He called Captain Walpole into his office.
He said, I am going to give you Concorde Division, which is going to be created, and it's up to you, and you form your own team, to turn Concorde's losses into profit in 2 years. He said, if after 2 years it's still losing money for British Airways, then I will terminate the operation.
Failure would spell the end of Concorde and the end of supersonic flight. The new Concorde division set to work. Brian Walpole and Jock Lowe looked at the routes, the fares, the flight timings, the sandwiches, everything. And they asked businessmen how much they thought a ticket on Concorde cost.
Well, most of them didn't know. It was their secretaries of travel companies that were doing the bookings. And when asked to guess, because the senior, very important people, they all guessed that the fare was higher. So very simply, we said, we'll charge them what they think they're paying. And so we put the fares up.
The move was a stroke of pure genius. Concorde was rebranded to provide a super elite class for merchant bankers, corporate lawyers, the rich and the famous.
I think flying Concorde full stop made you feel like you were in a club. There was the business class lounge, and then there was the first class lounge, and then there was a Concorde lounge. I mean, you were made to feel that way.
Concorde became the place to be seen.
I used to ask people for their autographs, and towards the end I got a little bit picky who I asked, you know. I've got Paul McCartney here, and he sang me a little song in the aisle. Concorde, 20th of May, every good wish, Henry Kissinger. Engelbert Humperdinck. Margaret Thatcher.
No aircraft, before or since, attracted as much publicity as Concorde. During Live Aid on the 13th of July 1985, 1 billion television viewers around the world watched Phil Collins dash between concerts in London and Philadelphia on the same day.
I was invited up to the cockpit to report back to Wembley and Bob Geldof and Billy Connolly. And I put the headphones on and someone said, so, what's it like? And Billy Connolly said, "It could be fucking anywhere. You know, we don't even. He could be underwater. We don't even know he's in Concorde." And then when I left to go back to my seat, the pilot said, "We're not supposed to do this, so don't tell anybody." And the world is watching. The world is watching. I thought that was quite cute, you know.
And when ordinary people wanted to fly Concorde, BA was quick to take the cash with cheaper charter flights.
My son said, you won't get her on there if she won't even get on a 12 bus.
It was such a lovely atmosphere, and I remember once having a Spitfire pilot. It was just so satisfying to be able to take him up to the flight deck, and he had all his medals on, and so it was just delightful to take him up to introduce him to the captain.
Concorde flew out of the red and into profit. During the good years, the small fleet of just 7 aircraft generated up to a staggering 25% of BA's profits.
We made about £500 million, £500 million net clear profit. And suddenly now, everybody loved us, and we did. We loved being involved with the aeroplane as well. So it was a wonderful emotion, positive, successful emotion.
For once in her life, Concorde's future looked secure. But then in 2000, disaster. Concorde had an enviable safety record, especially for an aircraft working at such extremes. There had never been a fatality. But that was to change on the 25th of July, 2000. That afternoon, 100 passengers eagerly awaited Air France Flight 4590 to John F. Kennedy Airport. A German company had specially chartered the Concorde as a spectacular start to a 16-day cruise leaving New York. But there was a delay. The Concorde Air France planned to fly was out of service, and they were using a standby, Sierra Charlie, the oldest Concorde in the fleet. It had a fault on the thrust reverser on engine number 2. The repairs would hold up the flight for 2 hours. Meanwhile, there was confusion in the dispatch area. 500 kilograms of extra luggage had been loaded without being recorded on the manifest.
C'est bon.
On the flight deck, the crew were keen to take off. The captain was Christian Marty, a French national celebrity, the first man to windsurf the Atlantic. He'd ordered the maximum amount of fuel. Concorde needed every drop to get to New York. Marty expected to burn 2 tons just taxiing out to the runway. With the thrust reverser fixed, the passengers finally started to board. The dispatcher brought Marty the manifest. It listed the overall weight, crucial for calculating the takeoff. But without the extra luggage, it showed the aircraft lighter than it was. In the South Air Traffic Control Tower, Concorde's flight controller was Gilles Logelin.
Air France 4590, bonjour.
4590, bonsoir.
The flight recorders give us a record of every word spoken that day.
Approchez-le de vous et mettez-le devant votre bouche comme nous vous le montrons.
The airport was busy. At the far end of runway 26 right, an Air France 747 was waiting to cross on its way to the terminal. It had landed moments earlier. On board was the French President Jacques Chirac, who was returning from a G8 summit in Japan.
Mesdames et messieurs, nous attendons quelques instants pendant que le Concorde utilise la piste en face de nous.
At 4:42, Captain Marty lined up the Concorde on the runway. They hadn't used over half the taxiing fuel. This now made the aircraft an additional ton overweight.
Air France 45-90,
piste 26 droite.
Vent 0,90, 8 nœuds. Décollage autorisé.
Est-ce que tout le monde est prêt? Oui. Oui. Air 100, B1, 150, top.
Marty accelerated to V1, the speed at which he was committed to take off.
V1. Attention!
Concorde 45-90, vous avez des flammes derrière vous.
Ouais, non, moteur 2. Le
45-90, vous avez de fortes flammes derrière vous. Encore un quart d'heure là, j'ai coupé. Non, le train ne rentre pas. Pompier leader, le Concorde, je ne connais pas ses intentions. Bonjour, le pompier. Retard.
Il faut leur laisser le pompier. Non?
The terrifying last moments were videoed from inside the cab of a passing truck. The flight of Air France 4590 lasted less than 90 seconds. The Concorde had crashed 3 miles from the airport into a small hotel close to the town of Gonesse. All 100 passengers and 9 crew on board, and 4 people on the ground were killed. Patrick Tess, owner of the hotel next door, was just yards away from the point of impact.
So I was in my office, on the telephone with my back to the window. Then my conversation was drowned out by an extraordinary noise. I turned around, and there I saw, facing me, Concorde in flames and at a high angle, approaching the hotel at breakneck speed. And its course made me think it would hit this side. And then I thought I had just a few seconds to live.
Madame Christine Turpin was on her way back from the shops.
And I saw a plane with fire behind it, and I was just stupefied. I saw it was Concorde. I was so surprised to see the plane like that, which went like this, and then it fell like that. I thought he had fallen on my house. I was so surprised. I stopped. I called the fire department. There was no answer. I called my home. No answer. So I left the car and went to the accident site.
One of our clients wrapped himself in a towel soaked in the bath to get closer to the fire. But he came out a few seconds later telling us it's not worth it, don't go there. There's nothing left, just bodies. And actually, we saw that there were bodies, pieces of people.
And there you are. It's sad.
The aircraft, loaded with fuel, burned for 3 hours. The emergency services placed road cones to mark the human remains. News flashed around the world.
And I thought, why, how, what's gone wrong? My heart dropped, because in all the years that I'd been perhaps responsible for British Airways Concorde, as many others were as well, I dreaded a major accident.
I, like most people involved with the aircraft closely, was in a state of shock for several days. And as the facts slowly began to emerge, it just made me feel sick. Sick in the stomach, it really did.
Debris from the crash was taken to the hangars at Le Bourget. the airport where Captain Marty had hoped to land. Immediately, the French investigation unit, the BEA, started to look into possible causes. Work colleagues of the dead crew, who knew their voices, came in to help decipher the recordings. The BEA was assisted by foreign investigators, including American Robert McIntosh from the National Transportation Safety Board.
We began to get a picture of the sequence of events. Certainly, we knew that there was a normal takeoff. We could hear this on the cockpit voice recorder. The aircraft accelerated up through 100 knots. It accelerated up through 150 knots. At a point of about 175 knots, there were things that were detected by the crew. There were noises. Something was going wrong. And then the heading of the aircraft, which would normally be straight down the runway, began to deviate off to the left.
The investigation switched to the runway. Tyre marks clearly showed the path the aircraft had taken, veering left to miss Chirac's 747 by just 30 feet. Chunks of rubber were evidence that one of the Concorde's tyres had burst.
This would be like something you might see on a highway that had come from a large truck.
And close by, the possible cause, a 43-centimetre strip of bent metal.
There was a piece of evidence, a metal strip that appeared to be of the same form as the cut on the tire.
Investigators believed the Concorde had gone over the metal strip, which cut and burst the tyre, sending a large chunk of rubber into the wing above.
And it literally broke the bottom of the tank, not by penetrating, but by forcing another part of the bottom of the tank to break loose.
What caused the fuel to ignite is still not clear. Possibly a spark from a broken electrical cable.
We noticed the aircraft took off early. At that time, there was this huge flame that had developed on the left side, and that's the famous picture that everybody saw.
Flames and debris were sucked into the air intakes, causing both engines to lose power.
On this particular takeoff, it never remotely got near its safety speed, and it never got above about 200 feet.
For the investigation, the question remained, where had the mysterious metal strip come from? Closer inspection revealed it was from the engine of a Continental Airlines DC-10, which had used the same runway just 5 minutes earlier. The French investigators were satisfied that they had solved the cause of the crash. But a number of Concorde pilots and engineers were not.
They're trying to suggest that that single strip of metal was the only reason that Concorde came down. I find totally unbelievable and implausible. Aircraft accidents are seldom down to one thing only. It's a combination of factors. And there were a lot of other factors at play in that day.
One of the central allegations involves a unique feature of Concorde. Fuel can be pumped from a rear tank forward to balance the aircraft for flight. As the Concorde was overweight, the flight engineer would have moved fuel forwards to compensate. At the crash site, switches were found left on, suggesting this could be the case. It may have been fuel was pumped into the tank above the bursting tyre, overfilling it.
And so you get this great lump of rubber slamming into the underside of the wing by tank number 5, literally like a missile strike, and it set up a shockwave in the fuel in that tank, and the energy in that shockwave had absolutely nowhere to go because there's no airspace. And I think it is quite reasonable to argue that if the fuel tanks had not been overfilled for that takeoff, and this is my view, I emphasize that, but I think it's quite possible that the subsequent disaster might not have happened.
Air France agree that fuel pumping is normal procedure, but dispute the tank could have been overfilled.
We transfer between 800 kilos to 1 ton, but always with automatic level detection systems. There cannot be any overfilling of a tank with these systems, which are automatic.
But it's not only operating procedures that have come under scrutiny. Serious questions have been raised about whether Concorde had fatal design flaws.
A great big buzz going around saying that Concorde was inherently unsafe, it was a fragile bird, and that, quite honestly, in my opinion, is a load of rubbish.
Don't try and tell me that there were design deficiencies in Concorde. I do not accept that. I spent 15 years flying that airplane, and I regard it as the safest airplane I have ever flown.
In the 10 years since the crash, the big question is, was Concorde an accident waiting to happen? What exactly caused the Air France Concorde crash, and who was to blame, has become the subject of a long and bitter court battle. Continental Airlines and 5 individuals from America and France are charged with involuntary manslaughter. All deny the charges. In a glass case lie key exhibits, including the metal strip from the Continental Airlines DC-10 that is alleged to have burst the Concorde's tyre. Continental has hired one of France's leading lawyers, who argues that the airline is not to blame.
They want to make this strip into the guilty party. It's so much easier to place the blame on others. Can you imagine, for a moment, that a plane could crash because of a small strip measuring 3 centimeters wide, 48 centimeters long, and 1 millimeter thick? Surely a plane could resist that.
Aircraft are built to withstand tyre bursts. But Concorde has had 57 burst or deflated tyres, some with near catastrophic results. The most dangerous and dramatic has striking parallels with the 2000 crash. On the 14th of June 1979, a Concorde flight was leaving Washington for Paris. Among the passengers was an aviation consultant, Bill Lightfoot. His seat window had a view of the wing.
I boarded Concorde, sat down. We then went through the normal pre-takeoff procedures, and then just as the aircraft rotated, getting ready to take off, there was a violent shudder. The aircraft shook like that. And then just almost at the same instant, a large object flashed by my window vertically. And there was a big jagged hole in the wing. And some sort of fluid spewing out of the hole. And I was thinking, what would happen if this aircraft tried to go supersonic? There's no doubt in my mind, and engineers I've talked to said the same. It would have just come apart.
Ma'am, could you please go?
The flight attendant came, and I said, "You've got a problem here. There's a hole in the wing." And she said, "No, that's the flaps." And I said, no, that is not the flaps. So I told her, go get someone. Someone's got to look at that.
Could you please get a flight crew?
Actually, although it's hard to believe, they'd started serving drinks.
Would you like a drink, sir?
No, I don't want a drink. I'd like a flight crew member, please.
Okay, I will inform someone.
So then the co-pilot or engineer came back, and I just literally took his head and pushed it over so he could see out of the small window, like that, so he could see through the hole. He could see this ragged hole in the wing, and he said, I'll never forget, he said, Mon Dieu. And he just turned ashen. And then he zipped up the aisle. Then just less than a minute later, they jerked the throttles back, and you could feel the plane violently slow down.
Photographs taken at the time show the fuel spilling from the aircraft. 2 tires had exploded, and wheel shrapnel had penetrated the wing. With a shattered undercarriage, the Air France pilot made a difficult landing. Shortly after the incident, France's aviation watchdogs advised further investigation of the wings and possible modifications.
These modifications did not take place. Its recommendations were not implemented. What did the recommendations consist of? To strengthen the fuel tanks with Kevlar.
In fact, the exact same modifications that would be made to Concorde after the 2000 crash.
In other words, if they had followed these recommendations, there would not have been all those deaths.
Airbus, then Aerospatiale, and Concorde's manufacturer says that at the time, it agreed with aviation authorities to focus on the causes of the accident rather than the effects, and so the wings were not modified. But possible causes of the crash have also focused on Air France's maintenance, and in particular, a large tubular spacer.
I was looking at the wreckage in the sheds at Le Bourget with a British Airways engineer who had come over to assist, and he noted fairly rapidly that this spacer was missing, and it was in fact found subsequently.
Investigators later found the missing spacer in Air France's workshops. It had been left off Concorde's undercarriage 7 days earlier during routine maintenance.
Clearly, and Air France has always said it, it was a maintenance error.
One of the functions of the spacer was to keep the wheels, the 4 wheels in that undercarriage truck, locked in proper alignment. With the spacer missing, those wheels could wobble around a bit like wheels on a supermarket trolley. Those wheels skewed around and effectively steered the airplane off the left-hand side of the runway.
Missing Chirac's 747 by just 30 feet. But the French BEA investigation concluded that the missing spacer had not contributed to the crash.
It's an important question to know whether a missing spacer might be linked in any way with the accident. Clearly, whether it was the BEA or the legal experts, or all the specialists we heard during the trial, they all said no. It had no effect.
Yeah, the BA report concluded that the missing spacer was not relevant to the accident. I believe personally there's an argument to say that the possible effects of this on the steering of the aircraft and on the tyres possibly could be looked at somewhat further.
But the most startling claim by Continental is that 18 eyewitnesses, including firemen and other airline pilots, saw Concorde on fire 700 meters before it hit the metal strip.
Extraordinaire. Extraordinary. The plane was on fire, and the firefighters were at right angles to the Concorde when it passed in front of them. And firefighters, I think, know what a fire is.
One of those to claim he saw Concorde on fire before it hit the metal strip was a contractor working at the airport.
Around 4 o'clock, I heard the sound of Concorde starting to go, so I turned to look at the aircraft, and then I saw it begin to gain speed, with a small flame under the left side. I said to myself, it won't take off like that. So compared to those who show you where the strip was, the plane was already on fire before that.
The BEA was approached about the eyewitness accounts and issues arising from its report, but declined, saying it was not its policy to comment on investigations. The trial judges will deliver their verdict in the autumn.
I have the feeling in this case that everything is being done to protect the image of France, the image of Concorde.
10 years on, Concorde's crash site is surrounded by razor wire. Close by, a memorial stands to the memory of the 113 who died.
It should never have happened. A lot of people, innocent, good people, lost their lives. This wonderful airplane was given a reputation which it didn't deserve. And to this day, it still makes me angry to think about it. It really does.
Back in 2000, to ensure the accident would never be repeated, bulletproof Kevlar was finally fitted in the vulnerable fuel tanks. And new tyres were developed that remained intact when punctured, a modification that would benefit all aircraft. The final cost of alterations was $1.5 million for each Concorde. The relaunch approached in 2001. And to signal to the world their continuing faith in Concorde, British Airways splashed out a further $14 million on a new interior for the fleet by king of modern design, Sir Terence Conran.
Nice calm colour scheme, nothing too jazzy. It was very sophisticated interior, just like a beautiful bit of French fashion. Everything we thought about, everything was meant to symbolise the best British quality.
13 months after the crash, Concorde was ready to take its first passengers. But first, Captain Mike Bannister had to do a complete mock-up flight.
So we planned to have a flight that would go halfway to New York and come back. The pilots will have flown the airplane for the first time with passengers on board for some time, baggage loading, the whole thing.
And the flight went wonderfully. The feel of elation of absolutely everybody on board was fantastic. We were really all up there. And we got off the airplane and my mobile phone rang. And it was my youngest son. He was saying, "Dad, have you heard what's happened in New York?"
And we had landed back at Heathrow just before the first airplane crashed into the World Trade Center.
And then my son said, "Oh my God, an airplane's hit the other tower." And at that point, we looked at each other and knew exactly what this meant. It was so sad.
That day, Concorde lost 40 of its most frequent flyers. And Concorde's lifeblood, the business community, stopped travelling across the Atlantic. But it wasn't the terrorists who would finally kill the age of supersonic flight. During the Queen's Golden Jubilee, the nation's pride soared as a British Concorde reappeared in public after the Air France crash.
As we got close to the palace and sort of came over Admiralty Arch and looked down the Mall, something really astounding happened. I've never seen 1 million plus people. 1 million people not very far away because we were flying at just over 300 meters above the ground. And you could see them waving and cheering, waving flags and hats and throwing things in the air. It was astoundingly emotional. And you could see Her Majesty standing on the balcony, and she happened to be wearing a flame orange outfit, and so you could see her quite clearly. And that really was fantastic, and to be part of something like that was brilliant.
Concorde was back, but in the post-9/11 world, revenues were down. And for Air France, matters were even worse. On some flights, the airline flew with only 6 paying passengers in its 100 seats. Then, Air France had a scare with another Concorde. On a scheduled flight to the US, an engine failed. The failure wasn't itself a crisis, but it caused a massive fuel leak. With tanks almost empty, the Air France Concorde only just made it to Halifax International in Nova Scotia.
Now that of itself was quite a serious incident, and so perhaps it didn't come as a huge surprise when we were starting to get a feeling that they were seriously thinking about stopping operating.
Faced with escalating costs, Air France debated whether Concorde had had its day. At the same time, Airbus, who kept the Concorde fleet airworthy, announced that the maintenance charges would have to go up by £40 million. BA had already spent millions of pounds refitting Concorde. Now it was confronted with the news of more costs, and without Air France, it decided it couldn't go it alone.
And I'm sorry to say, British Airways, rather weakly in my opinion, rolled over and capitulated to this French ultimatum. And so I get very upset about the way in which Concorde ended its life.
Just 17 months after the relaunch, BA and Air France announced that they were retiring their Concorde fleets. It was the end of over 27 years of supersonic travel.
Could have carried on technically, of course. It could carry on now. It could carry on for another 20 years. But it would cost more, and there simply wasn't the demand or the commercial drive to do it.
In aviation terms, the Concordes were mere spring chickens, with only a quarter of the wear of an average 747. At 4 p.m. on the 24th of October 2003, 3 aircraft landed in sequence at Heathrow, watched by crowds of thousands.
I came back from New York sitting next to David Frost, who was, of course, an enormously regular customer. And when we arrived at Heathrow, there were tears in our eyes. It was very emotional. No, it felt a bit like if one of your family had died. Very sad. It symbolized optimism. It was everything that the 20th century could have stood for.
I walked out of the hangar, the last person to leave, and it was misty and there were neon lights. And as I crossed the tarmac, there were 5 perfectly serviceable Concordes sitting there that I knew would never ever carry a fare-paying passenger again. And I think that's the first time that the emotional side of what had happened really hit me.
Of the 20 Concordes ever built, 18 remain sleeping at museums across the world. Her elite class of pilots either retired or relegated to flying lesser aircraft. During the final flights, flight engineers stuck their caps in a gap that opened up as the aircraft expanded with the heat of supersonic speed. Now they remain wedged forever in the cold fuselages. With little chance of renewing her certificate of airworthiness, it is unlikely that Concorde will ever fly again.
Concorde was a way of life for us, a complete way of life, one of which we were intensely proud.
Concorde gave us that aspiration, that dream, that focus, that pride, and just that lovely picture of it flying overhead.
To me, it was a fusion of art and technology. Oh, I sort of live it. It's sort of inside me, Concorde.
In my opinion, there's no argument it was the greatest engineering achievement of the 20th century, bar none. She was and is amazing.
This coming Wednesday night from 9 o'clock. What it's like to be living with Bruce Forsyth. It's a very intimate, cutting edge. Tonight, JJ and Josie, round 2 in Big Brother.